You think you can hit that target?" They laughed. Impossible distance. But when the target exploded, the laughter stopped. Because some people write history in silence. Hello, everyone. Tell us in the comments which city and country you're watching from today. And don't forget to subscribe to Real Heroes Stories YT for more incredible military stories that honor our silent heroes. Fort Bragg, North Carolina. Tuesday, March 15th, 2024. 2:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the Special Operations Command shooting range, where legends were born and dreams were shattered with equal frequency. Today would be different. Today, an 18-year record would fall like a house of cards, and 8 cocky recruits would learn the hardest lesson the military teaches, that assumptions can be deadlier than bullets. Marcus Thomas Riley stood at the eastern edge of the range, positioned exactly 37 yards behind the primary firing line, watching everything with the practiced eye of a man who'd seen too much and remembered it all. At 42 years old, he possessed the kind of unremarkable appearance that allowed him to blend into crowds, disappear in plain sight, and move through the world without drawing the attention that had once made him the most sought-after asset in the entire United States Special Operations Command. 6 feet tall, 175 pounds, graying brown hair kept in military regulation despite his civilian status. His hands showed calluses from working with tools and weapons, but his eyes, those pale gray eyes that seemed to catalog everything and forget nothing, told a different story entirely. They were the eyes of a hunter, a predator, a man who'd spent years looking through high-powered scopes at targets that breathed, bled, and died when he pulled the trigger. His military identification card bore the designation Consultant, Range Safety Operations. No rank insignia, no unit patches, no indication whatsoever that this quiet, unassuming man had once carried the call sign Phantom 7 and held the record for the longest confirmed sniper kill in the history of modern warfare. No hint that his name was still spoken in whispers in certain Pentagon briefing rooms, where the most classified missions were planned and executed. The morning had begun like hundreds of others. Marcus had arrived at the main gate at 0800 hours sharp, presented his credentials to the military police guard who barely glanced at his face, and driven his unremarkable Ford F-150 pickup truck to the assigned parking area. He'd signed in with Staff Sergeant Jake Morrison, collected his safety equipment and observation gear, and taken his designated position to monitor the day's training activities. It was supposed to be routine. Watch a group of newly minted Special Forces recruits attempt their final long-range marksmanship qualification. Document their performance, file a report with the appropriate training command, collect his daily consultant fee, drive home to his modest apartment in Fayetteville, and spend another evening pretending he was just another middle-aged contractor making ends meet. But the universe, it seemed, had other plans. Staff Sergeant Jake Morrison, a compact 38-year-old career soldier with 15 years of service and 3 combat deployments to Afghanistan under his belt, was conducting what the Army officially called Advanced Long-Range Marksmanship Assessment Protocol. 8 highly trained soldiers would attempt something that hadn't been accomplished on this range since Master Sergeant Tom Mitchell made the shot in October of 2006. The target, a 12-inch diameter steel plate mounted on a reinforced stand, sat on a distant hillside exactly 1,850 yards from the firing line. 1,850 yards. More than a mile. A distance that separated the competent from the exceptional, the skilled from the legendary. For 18 years, that steel circle had stood unconquered, a silent testament to the difference between theoretical marksmanship and practical impossibility. Morrison had personally witnessed over 300 attempts at that target during his tenure as rangemaster. He'd seen Olympic-caliber marksmen miss by margins that would have been considered respectable at half the distance. He'd watched Special Forces veterans with multiple combat tours shake their heads in frustration after their bullets fell short, or drifted wide in the capricious North Carolina wind. The closest anyone had come in recent years was Staff Sergeant Maria Santos, a former Marine Corps sniper instructor who'd managed to strike the mounting post just 6 inches below the target. Her shot had been technically perfect in terms of windage, but had fallen victim to an atmospheric pressure change that occurred in the 3 seconds between her final calculations and her trigger pull. "All right, warriors," Morrison called out to the 8 soldiers lined up behind the firing line like eager racehorses waiting for the starting gun. "Today we separate the wannabes from the legends. You've been training for this moment for 6 months. You know the drill, you know the conditions, and you know what's at stake. 1 shot each at the long-range target. 1,850 yards of honest distance between you and immortality." He paused, letting his words sink in as he studied their faces. They were good. He had to give them that. This wasn't some random collection of basic training graduates playing soldier for the weekend. These were carefully selected special operations candidates who'd survived months of the most demanding military training in the world. Each one represented the top 1% of their respective specialties, handpicked for their combination of technical skill, mental toughness, and raw potential. "Current environmental conditions," he continued, consulting the digital weather station mounted on a tripod beside the firing line. "Wind speed, steady 12 miles per hour with gusts to 15, bearing approximately 45 degrees from the northeast. Temperature, 76 degrees Fahrenheit and rising. Barometric pressure, 30.17 inches of mercury and stable. Relative humidity, 43%. These conditions will remain constant for the next 2 hours." The recruits, 5 men and 3 women ranging in age from 22 to 28, all wearing the distinctive green berets that marked them as Special Forces candidates, shifted nervously as they absorbed the technical data. They'd spent countless hours in classroom instruction learning how environmental factors affected long-range ballistics, but classroom theory and field reality were separated by the same gulf that divided success from failure at extreme distances. Private First Class Danny Weber, a 6'3" string bean from Corpus Christi, Texas, was easily the most vocal member of the group. At 24 years old, he possessed the kind of supreme confidence that came from growing up in hunting country, where a 400-yard shot was considered routine and 600 yards was merely challenging. 18 years, Weber said loud enough for everyone to hear. "Hell, that just means they haven't had anyone with real shooting experience try it yet. I've been making shots like this since I was old enough to see over the hood of my daddy's pickup truck." Private Second Class Sarah Chen, a 26-year-old former computer programmer from Palo Alto who'd enlisted after growing tired of Silicon Valley culture, rolled her eyes dramatically. "Right, Weber. Because shooting deer in South Texas is exactly the same as military precision marksmanship under controlled conditions with witnesses and pressure." "Pressure?" Weber laughed. "Lady, I grew up hunting wild boar in brush country where you get 1 shot before they charge. You think a steel target on a hill is pressure?" Private James Rodriguez, a compact former infantryman from the Bronx who'd earned his way into Special Forces through pure determination and natural shooting ability, tried to play peacekeeper. "Come on, guys. We're all supposed to be on the same team here. Save the trash talk for after we see who can actually make the shot. Private Lisa Morgan, a former Marine Corps markswoman from Denver who'd transferred to the Army specifically to join Special Forces, just smiled quietly and continued checking her equipment. At 27, she was the oldest member of the group and the only one with actual combat experience. She'd spent 2 tours in Afghanistan as a designated marksman and knew better than anyone the difference between range shooting and the real thing. Private Kevin O'Brien, a red-haired former police SWAT sniper from Boston, was conducting his own mental calculations. 1850 with a 12-mile-per-hour crosswind. That's roughly 6 to 8 minutes of angle windage compensation, depending on the bullet's ballistic coefficient. Private Amanda Foster, a former Air Force Security Forces member from Phoenix, nodded in agreement. More like 8 to 10 minutes, I think. The .300 Winchester Magnum drops significantly at that distance, and the crosswind's going to push it hard. Private Michael Patterson, a 23-year-old former Navy SEAL candidate from Virginia Beach who'd washed out of Bud S due to a training injury, remained silent. He'd learned the hard way that talking about shots was very different from making them. Marcus Riley listened to their conversation from his observation post, mentally cataloging their personalities, their levels of experience, their individual approaches to the challenge ahead. Their banter was typical of elite soldiers, part nervous energy, part genuine confidence, part psychological warfare designed to unsettle potential competitors. What struck him most was their complete certainty that someone among them would succeed where hundreds of others had failed. It was the arrogance of youth combined with the confidence that came from extensive training, and while it was necessary for success in special operations, it also blinded them to the reality of what they were attempting. Marcus had made shots at 1,850 yards and beyond more times than he could count. He'd done it in Afghanistan's thin mountain air, where bullets flew differently than at sea level. He'd done it in Iraq's desert heat, where mirage and temperature gradients played havoc with optical systems. He'd done it in Syria's urban environments, where wind patterns were unpredictable and escape routes were measured in seconds rather than minutes. But those shots had been taken under circumstances where failure meant death. His own, or that of American soldiers, depending on his accuracy. The pressure these recruits felt was nothing compared to the weight of knowing that 8 Rangers were pinned down by enemy fire and wouldn't see another sunrise unless a single bullet found its mark at an impossible distance. "First shooter, step to the line," Morrison commanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd earned the right to judge others' performance through his own blood, sweat, and sacrifice. Private Rodriguez moved forward with careful precision. He carried the Remington M24 sniper weapon system, a precision rifle built around the Remington 700 Action and chambered in .300 Winchester Magnum, with the reverence reserved for instruments capable of reaching out across vast distances to touch targets with surgical precision. Rodriguez settled into a prone position behind the rifle, his movements deliberate and controlled. He adjusted the Harris bipod legs to achieve the proper shooting angle, checked the scope's eye relief to ensure optimal sight picture, and began the mental checklist that every precision shooter learns. Stock weld, cheek placement, breathing control, trigger finger positioning, natural point of aim. Through the loopholed Mark IV scope mounted on the rifle's Picatinny rail, the distant target looked impossibly small. A 12-inch circle of steel at 1,850 yards subtended an angular measurement of less than half a minute of angle, smaller than the apparent size of a quarter held at arm's length. "Range is hot," Morrison announced, his voice carrying across the entire complex. "All personnel behind the firing line. Shooter has control. Target, 1,850 yards, bearing 185 degrees. Wind, 12 miles per hour, steady from the northeast. One shot. Make it count. Rodriguez took his time, as he should have. This wasn't a combat situation where speed might mean survival. This was precision shooting at its most demanding level, where patience and methodical preparation separated success from failure. He controlled his breathing, establishing the rhythm that would allow him to fire during his natural respiratory pause. He calculated windage and elevation adjustments based on the environmental conditions Morrison had provided. When he finally squeezed the trigger, the .300 Winchester Magnum cartridge exploded from the 24-inch barrel with a thunderous crack that echoed across the range and sent a flock of crows spiraling up from the surrounding pine trees. Everyone raised binoculars and spotting scopes to track the bullet's flight toward the distant hillside. For approximately 1.8 seconds, the time required for a .300 Winchester Magnum bullet to cover 1,850 yards. The range fell silent, except for the whisper of wind through the pine trees. Impact. The bullet struck red North Carolina clay approximately 180 yards short of the target, kicking up a distinctive puff of dust that was clearly visible through optical equipment. "Miss," Morrison called out matter-of-factly. "Approximately 180 yards short. Next shooter." Rodriguez stood slowly, ejected the spent brass casing, and handed the rifle to Private Chen without comment. His face showed professional disappointment, but not surprise. He'd known the odds when he stepped to the line. Private Chen approached the firing line with the measured confidence of someone who'd learned to trust technical knowledge over raw instinct. As a former software engineer, she approached marksmanship the same way she'd approached coding problems, as a series of variables that could be calculated, adjusted, and optimized for the desired outcome. She settled into position and immediately began making scope adjustments based on Rodriguez's miss. If his bullet had fallen 180 yards short, that suggested the need for additional elevation compensation, approximately 4 to 5 minutes of angle, depending on the specific ballistic characteristics of the ammunition being used. Chen's shot was technically superior to Rodriguez's. Her shooting position was textbook perfect, her breathing control was exemplary, and her trigger press was smooth and consistent. When the rifle fired, she maintained perfect follow-through, keeping the crosshairs on target until the bullet struck dirt approximately 95 yards short of the target. "Miss," Morrison announced. 95 yards short. Significant improvement. Next shooter." One by one, the remaining recruits took their turns at immortality. Private Weber, despite all his bragging about childhood hunting exploits, sent his bullet wide left, when a sudden wind gust caught it mid-flight and exposed the difference between theoretical knowledge and practical application. His face flushed red as he handed back the rifle without making eye contact with his fellow recruits. Private Morgan came closest of all. Her shot struck dirt just 47 yards short of the target, close enough to suggest that she understood the fundamentals of extreme long-range shooting, but had simply underestimated the atmospheric conditions that affected bullet flight at such distances. She accepted the result with the quiet professionalism of someone who'd learned long ago that close only counted in horseshoes and hand grenades. Private O'Brien's bullet went high and right, victim of a miscalculation regarding the Coriolis effect, the influence of the Earth's rotation on projectile flight at extreme ranges. Private Foster managed to achieve the correct elevation, but was defeated by the crosswind that pushed her bullet approximately 30 yards left of the target. Private Patterson's shot fell victim to a scope tracking error that sent his bullet high and into the hillside above the target. After the 8th recruit failed, Morrison began the process of clearing the range and securing the weapons. The afternoon's training evolution was officially complete, and while several of the attempts had been impressive by normal standards, none had achieved the breakthrough that would etch a new name into Fort Bragg's record books. "That concludes today's assessment," Morrison announced. "Good shooting, all of you." Some of those attempts were the closest I've seen in years. Weapons clearing will commence in 5 minutes. All personnel prepare to. "Sergeant," Marcus Riley called out quietly from his observation position. "Mind if I take a look at that target?" The 8 recruits turned to stare at the civilian contractor who'd been watching silently all afternoon from his position behind the firing line. Most of them had barely registered his presence. He was just another piece of range furniture, no more noteworthy than the wind flags or the target stands. Private Weber recovered his composure first and couldn't resist the opportunity to redirect attention away from his own disappointing performance. "What, the safety guy wants to play soldier now?" This should be entertaining. A few of the other recruits chuckled, but Morrison didn't join in their amusement. Something about Marcus Riley had been nagging at him all afternoon. The way the man carried himself, the way his eyes tracked movement around the range, the unconscious way he'd been calculating wind speed and direction throughout the day, his head turning slightly to feel changes in air movement that others missed entirely. Morrison had spent enough time around genuine operators to recognize certain tells. The way Riley stood with his weight slightly forward on the balls of his feet, ready to move in any direction. The way his eyes never stopped moving, constantly scanning for threats or changes in his environment, the way he'd positioned himself to maintain clear sight lines to all exits while keeping his back to solid cover. "You sure about this, sir?" Morrison asked carefully. Marcus walked toward the firing line without responding to Weber's taunt, his movement casual but somehow purposeful. Morrison handed him a pair of military-grade binoculars, Steiner 15 by 80 models that provided the magnification and clarity necessary for target observation at extreme ranges. Targets at bearing 185 degrees, range 185 0 yards, Morrison said, falling into the professional shorthand that military personnel used when discussing technical specifications. "Wind's been consistent all afternoon, 12 miles per hour, gusting to 15 from the northeast." Marcus studied the target through the binoculars for what seemed like an unusually long time. To the recruits watching, he probably looked like any other middle-aged civilian trying to understand what they'd been attempting to accomplish. They had no idea he was calculating factors they hadn't even considered. The slight temperature inversion that was beginning to develop as the afternoon progressed would create a density gradient that would affect bullet trajectory in subtle but measurable ways. The crosswind wasn't completely steady. Marcus could see the wind flags indicating periodic shifts in direction that would require constant recalculation. Most importantly, the mirage patterns visible through the high magnification optics told a story about atmospheric stability that could make the difference between success and failure. "Interesting challenge," Marcus said finally, lowering the binoculars. "Mind if I give it a try?" The question detonated like a flashbang grenade in the midst of the group. The recruits burst into open laughter, their previous disappointment temporarily forgotten in the face of such apparent audacity. "Are you kidding me?" Weber shook his head in disbelief. "Dude, we just watched 8 Special Forces candidates miss that target. 8 soldiers who've been training specifically for this shot for 6 months. What makes you think some paper-pushing contractor can do better?" Private Chen was slightly more diplomatic, but no less skeptical. "No offense, sir, but that's not exactly a beginner's shot. We're talking about variables that require years of training to understand properly. Marcus smiled, the first genuine emotion he'd shown all day. It was a quiet smile, devoid of arrogance or challenge, carrying instead the kind of calm confidence that came from knowledge rather than assumption. "You're absolutely right," he said. "It's not a beginner's shot at all." Something in his tone made Morrison look at him more carefully. There was a quality to Riley's voice, a certainty that went beyond mere confidence. Morrison had heard that tone before, in the voices of men who'd operated in places where missing wasn't an option, and second chances were rarely available. "You sure about this, sir?" Morrison asked again, but this time the question carried a different weight. "One shot," Marcus replied simply. "Same conditions everyone else had. Fair enough?" Morrison nodded slowly and gestured toward the rifle. "Range rules apply. Single shot, same ammunition, same environmental conditions." As Marcus accepted the M24 from Rodriguez, something fundamental shifted in the atmosphere around the firing line. The casual observer might have missed it entirely, but Morrison caught it immediately. The weapon seemed to come alive in Marcus's hands, as if it had been waiting all day for someone who understood its true potential. His movements became fluid, practiced, automatic. The way he checked the chamber was economical and efficient. The way he tested the bolt action spoke of familiarity born from extensive use. The way he shouldered the rifle and found his natural point of aim was so smooth it looked choreographed. The recruits continued making jokes among themselves, but their voices seemed to fade into background noise as Marcus knelt behind the rifle, and the world began to narrow to just him, the weapon, and that distant target nearly a mile away. "You know," Marcus said conversationally, as he adjusted the loopholed scope's parallax setting for the correct range, "I haven't done this in a while. Might be a little rusty." He chambered a single-point, .300 Winchester Magnum cartridge, with a motion so smooth it appeared effortless, though Morrison noticed the unconscious way Riley's thumb tested the safety, even though he knew the weapon was set to fire. Muscle memory from years of handling weapons, where safety protocols meant the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. The recruits were still making comments about contractors and wannabe soldiers, but Marcus was disappearing into that zone that only true marksmen ever find. That place where heartbeat and breathing and wind speed and target distance all become part of a single equation. That place where the impossible becomes merely difficult, and the difficult becomes routine. But then, just as he was settling into his final sight picture, Marcus's phone vibrated against his chest. A text message. The timing couldn't have been worse. Marcus was in the final stages of his shooting sequence, his breathing controlled, his sight picture perfect, his mind calculating the hundreds of variables that would determine whether his bullet found its mark. The last thing he needed was a distraction. But when he glanced at the phone's screen, his face went pale. The message was from an unknown number. Phantom 7. Package compromised. Immediate extraction required. You have 72 hours. Confirm receipt. The phone nearly slipped from his hands. For just a moment, that perfect composure cracked like ice under pressure. The recruits couldn't see his face from their position behind and to the side of the firing line, but Morrison was positioned where he could observe the shooter, and he saw everything. Whatever was in that message had shaken this man to his core. "Everything all right, sir?" Morrison asked quietly, his voice carrying the concern of someone who'd seen too many soldiers receive bad news from home. Marcus stared at the phone's screen for another 5 seconds, his mind racing through possibilities and implications. Then he slowly tucked the device back into his pocket and returned his attention to the rifle. When he looked back through the scope, something had changed. The casual curiosity was gone, replaced by something much more intense, much more dangerous. Phantom 7. He hadn't heard that call sign in 5 years. 5 years since he'd walked away from a world where 1,850-yard shots were just another Tuesday afternoon. 5 years since he'd been the best long-range elimination specialist in the entire United States military. 5 years since the mission in the mountains of Afghanistan that had ended his career and sent him into the deepest cover the intelligence community could provide. But someone had found him. Someone knew where he was. Someone knew who he was. And if they'd found him, that meant the carefully constructed life he'd built as Marcus Riley, boring contractor, was about to come crashing down around him. "Sir?" Morrison's voice seemed to come from very far away. Marcus blinked, forcing himself to focus on the present moment. The target. The shot. The 8 recruits who had no idea they were watching a ghost prepare to announce his presence to the world. The text message had changed everything. This wasn't just about making an impressive shot anymore. This was about sending a message. If someone was coming for him, and the message suggested they were, then they needed to know exactly who they were dealing with. Marcus took a deep breath and let his training take over. Training that had been honed in the mountains of Afghanistan, the deserts of Iraq, the urban environments of Syria, and half a dozen other places where American Special Operations Forces operated in the shadows. Wind speed, 12 miles per hour with gusts to 15, bearing approximately 45 degrees from the northeast. Temperature, 76 degrees Fahrenheit and rising. Barometric pressure, stable. Range, exactly 1,850 yards. But this wasn't just about environmental conditions. This was about announcing to whoever had sent that message that Marcus Riley wasn't some helpless ex-soldier living in exile. This was about reminding certain people why they should have left him alone. Marcus's breathing slowed to match his resting heart rate. 4 counts in, hold for 4, 4 counts out. His pulse dropped to just above 60 beats per minute, the physiological state that allowed for maximum precision and control. The crosswind became just another variable in an equation he'd solved thousands of times before in places where the stakes were measured in American lives rather than personal pride. Through the scope, the distant target snapped into crystal clarity. 12 inches of steel, painted white for visibility, mounted on a stand that had been engineered to withstand impacts from high-velocity rifle bullets. He'd made shots like this in the Hindu Kush, when Taliban commanders thought they were safely hidden in cave complexes. He'd made them in Iraq's Anbar province, when insurgent leaders believed distance and concrete walls made them untouchable. This was just practice. But the recruits didn't know that. They saw only a middle-aged contractor who was about to embarrass himself in front of people who'd devoted their lives to the pursuit of military excellence. "Come on, old man," Weber's voice carried clearly across the range. "We don't have all day here. Just admit you can't make the shot and let us get back to the barracks." The other recruits chuckled appreciatively, but Marcus didn't hear them. He was somewhere else now, somewhere 8,000 miles away and 5 years in the past. A ridge overlooking the Korangal Valley in Afghanistan's Kunar province. An enemy sniper who'd been terrorizing a forward operating base for 3 weeks, picking off American soldiers with a precision that suggested professional training. Intelligence reports indicated the shooter was holed up in a cave complex at just over 2,700 yards, well beyond the effective range of conventional counter-sniper tactics. But Marcus Riley wasn't conventional. He'd spent 12 hours crawling into position through terrain that would have challenged a mountain goat, another 8 hours waiting for the perfect shot, lying motionless in 100-degree heat, while insects crawled across his face and insurgents moved through the valley below his position. When the target finally appeared, just the glint of a scope lens catching the morning sun, Marcus had perhaps 2 seconds to make a shot that would either save American lives or condemn him to discovery by enemy forces who showed no mercy to captured snipers. He'd taken the shot. The enemy sniper had simply ceased to exist. That elimination had earned him his 7th confirmed kill at ranges exceeding 2,000 yards. It had also earned him the Medal of Honor, though the citation was so heavily classified that fewer than 20 people in the world knew what he'd actually accomplished. Most importantly, it had earned him the call sign that would follow him for the rest of his life. Phantom 7. 7 confirmed kills at ranges exceeding 2,000 yards. 7 shots that had turned the tide of battle. 7 perfect moments when physics, skill, and necessity had aligned to create something that was part science, part art, and part magic. This would be number 8. Marcus exhaled slowly, letting his natural respiratory pause extend into that perfect moment of stillness that every marksman seeks. His finger found the trigger's break point, that precise pressure where the slightest additional force would release the firing pin and send a bullet racing toward its destination at nearly 3,000 feet per second. Time seemed to slow, as it always did in these moments. He could feel his heartbeat, steady and controlled. He could sense the wind's subtle shifts through nerve endings that had been trained to detect the slightest atmospheric changes. He could see the target with supernatural clarity, as if the scope had become an extension of his own vision. The rifle fired. The .300 Winchester Magnum cartridge exploded from the 24-inch barrel with the controlled violence of precision engineering. The 190-grain Sierra Match King bullet left the muzzle at 2,960 feet per second, spinning at 155,000 revolutions per minute, thanks to the rifling that would keep it stable throughout its flight. For 1.73 seconds, the bullet flew through North Carolina air, fighting crosswinds and atmospheric pressure, gradually slowing as air resistance took its toll. At the halfway point, it was still traveling at nearly 2,400 feet per second. By the time it covered 3/4 of the distance, it had slowed to just under 2,000 feet per second, but retained more than enough energy to deliver a devastating impact. The recruits tracked its flight through binoculars and spotting scopes, expecting to see another puff of dust marking another failure. Morrison held his breath, something deep in his military experience telling him that this shot was fundamentally different from all the others. At exactly 1.73 seconds after leaving the barrel, the bullet struck the 12-inch steel target with 1,847 foot-pounds of kinetic energy. The impact rang across the valley like a cathedral bell, a clear, pure tone that seemed to hang in the air long after the sound should have faded. The steel plate, designed to withstand thousands of impacts, actually flexed from the force of the hit before settling back into its mounting. Dead center, perfect shot, silence. Complete, absolute, overwhelming silence. Morrison slowly lowered his binoculars, his hands trembling slightly. In 15 years of running this range, overseeing thousands of training evolutions, watching hundreds of attempts at the legendary target, he'd never seen anything remotely like what had just occurred. The target hadn't just been hit. It had been centered. Dead center. A shot so perfect it would have made the old masters of marksmanship weep with professional admiration. "Holy shit," whispered Private Rodriguez, his voice barely audible in the stunned quiet that had fallen over the entire range. The recruits stood frozen, mouths open, their previous confidence and good-natured mockery evaporating like morning mist under the blazing reality of what they'd just witnessed. Private Weber, who'd been the loudest with his jokes and taunts, couldn't even form words. His face had gone pale beneath his tan, and his hands shook slightly as he lowered his binoculars. The casual contractor they'd been mocking, the boring middle-aged paper pusher they'd dismissed as a wannabe, had just accomplished something that none of them, despite their training, their youth, their confidence, and their extensive preparation, could even dream of achieving. Marcus Riley stood slowly, his movements deliberate and controlled. He ejected the spent brass casing, watching it arc through the air to land in the red clay with a small metallic ping. Then he handed the rifle back to Morrison with the same casual manner he might have used to return a borrowed tool. "Thank you, Sergeant," he said quietly, his voice carrying no triumph, no arrogance, no acknowledgement that he'd just done something extraordinary. "Nice rifle." "Good zero." Morrison's voice came out as barely a whisper. "Sir, what did you say your name was again?" "Riley. Marcus Riley." Morrison stared at him for a long moment, and slowly, like pieces of a puzzle falling into place, recognition began to dawn. The build, the age, the way he'd handled the rifle with such unconscious competence, the absolute confidence in attempting an impossible shot. Most of all, the way he'd made that shot look easy. "Phantom 7, Morrison breathed, the words escaping before he could stop them. The recruits looked confused, but Jake Morrison knew exactly who was standing in front of him. Marcus Phantom 7 Riley, the sniper who'd held the record for longest confirmed kill in Afghanistan, the ghost who'd operated so far behind enemy lines that his missions were still classified 5 years after his disappearance from active duty. The legend who'd simply vanished from the special operations community after a mission that nobody talked about but everyone remembered. "I thought you were—" Morrison started, then stopped himself. "Dead?" Marcus smiled grimly. "Some days I wish I was, Sergeant. But some of us don't get that luxury." He turned to walk away, but Morrison called after him. "Sir, that shot. It wasn't luck, was it?" Marcus paused without turning around, his silhouette framed against the late afternoon sun. "Sergeant, that target is 1,850 yards away. In the Hindu Kush Mountains of Afghanistan, I once eliminated a high-value target at 2,734 yards in a crosswind that would have grounded helicopters. This was just practice." As he walked toward the parking area, the questions began in earnest. "Who is he?" Private Chen asked, her voice hushed with something approaching awe. "What does Phantom 7 mean?" Rodriguez wanted to know. "How did he make that shot look so easy?" Foster added. Morrison looked at the 8 recruits who'd just witnessed something they'd tell their children and grandchildren about. That, warriors, was a masterclass in what real marksmanship looks like. Marcus Riley isn't just any contractor. He's probably the best long-range shooter this country has ever produced. 7 confirmed kills at ranges exceeding 2,000 yards. Missions so classified that members of Congress don't have clearance to know the details. "Why is he working as a contractor, then?" Weber asked, his earlier arrogance completely evaporated. Morrison shrugged. "Some people serve their country in uniform. Others serve it from the shadows. And sometimes, when the shadows get too dark, they find other ways to serve." But Morrison didn't know the real story. Didn't know about the mission in 2019 that had gone sideways when political considerations collided with military reality. Didn't know about the choice Marcus had been forced to make between following orders and following his conscience. Didn't know about the 3 American hostages who were still alive because Marcus had disobeyed a direct order from a general who'd never been closer to combat than a Pentagon briefing room. The official record showed that Master Sergeant Marcus Riley had suffered acute stress reaction during a classified mission and had been medically retired for psychological reasons. The unofficial record, known only to a handful of people with cosmic-level security clearances, told a different story entirely. A story of a soldier who'd been ordered to eliminate a target whose death would have served political rather than military objectives. A target whose elimination would have resulted in the deaths of 3 American aid workers who'd been captured by insurgents and were being held in the same compound. Marcus had been given explicit orders: eliminate the high-value target regardless of collateral damage. The political ramifications of the target's continued existence outweighed the lives of 3 humanitarian workers who'd voluntarily placed themselves in harm's way. But when Marcus had acquired the target in his scope, when he'd seen the 3 Americans bound and kneeling in the courtyard below his position, he'd made a choice that had ended his military career and sent him into the deepest cover the intelligence community could provide. Instead of taking the shot he'd been ordered to take, he'd spent 6 hours eliminating guards and clearing escape routes. Instead of following orders, he'd saved 3 lives. The target had escaped. The political situation had deteriorated exactly as the generals had predicted, and Marcus Riley had been given a choice: face a court-martial that would destroy his reputation and potentially expose classified operations, or accept a medical discharge and disappear into civilian life with conditions. He'd chosen the latter. The conditions had been extensive. He would remain available for consultation on specialized operations. He would maintain his security clearances for potential future use. He would submit to periodic psychological evaluations to ensure he remained stable. Most importantly, he would never speak about what had actually happened during that mission in Afghanistan. Marcus had agreed to all of it, but what the intelligence community hadn't expected was that he would disappear so completely. No veteran reunions, no contractor jobs with defense companies, no consultation work with law enforcement agencies. He'd simply become a ghost in truth, as well as name. Until today. As Marcus reached his vehicle, that same unremarkable Ford F-150 that had served as his cover for 5 years, he pulled out his phone and read the message again. Phantom 7, package compromised. Immediate extraction required. You have 72 hours. Confirm receipt. The number was blocked, but Marcus recognized the code phrases. Someone from his old world was reaching out. Someone who knew how to find him despite all his precautions. Someone who knew exactly who Marcus Riley really was. The package could refer to any number of things from his past. Classified documents he'd been given before his retirement, operational details that could compromise ongoing missions, names of assets still operating in hostile territory, or it could refer to the 3 American aid workers he'd saved in 2019. The ones whose rescue had never been officially acknowledged. The ones who were supposed to have died, along with their captors, in what would have been recorded as a failed rescue attempt. Marcus had ensured they lived. But in doing so, he'd also ensured that certain people would never forgive him for choosing human lives over political expedience. As he started the truck and drove away from Fort Bragg, Marcus Riley made a decision. He'd spent 5 years hiding, 5 years pretending to be just another middle-aged contractor trying to make ends meet in a world that had moved on without him. But if his past had finally caught up with him, if someone was coming for him, then it was time to stop hiding. It was time for Phantom 7 to come out of retirement. The text message had given him 72 hours. That was enough time to prepare, enough time to gather resources, enough time to remind certain people why they should have left him alone. But first, he had a phone call to make. Marcus pulled over at a rest stop 20 miles from Fort Bragg and dialed a number he hadn't used in 3 years. It rang twice before a gravelly voice answered. "Yeah? Tiger 6, this is Phantom 7. Silence on the other end that lasted so long, Marcus wondered if the call had been dropped. Then, "Jesus Christ, Marcus. I thought you were dead." "So did I, Tommy. But it looks like somebody wants to make it official. I need a favor." "Name it. I need to know who's looking for me. And I need to know what they want with the package. That might take some doing. You've been dark for 5 years. A lot of people have forgotten you exist." "Then remind them," Marcus said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who'd once operated at the highest levels of the special operations community. "And Tommy, tell them Phantom 7 just announced his presence at Fort Bragg. 1 shot, 1850 yards, dead center. The legend is back." He hung up and sat in the truck for a moment, processing what had just happened. For 5 years, he'd been Marcus Riley, boring contractor. But one text message, one impossible shot, and he was Phantom 7 again. The question was, who had sent the message, and what did they really want? Marcus started the truck and headed home to prepare for war. Because in his experience, when someone from the shadow world reached out after 5 years of silence, it meant only one thing. Somebody was about to die. And Marcus Riley intended to make sure it wasn't him. Back at Fort Bragg, the story was just beginning. By 1800 hours, word of the impossible shot had spread through the entire special operations community. By midnight, it had reached certain offices in Washington where Marcus Riley's name was still on very short, very classified lists. By dawn, phones were ringing in places where phones rarely rang. Because Phantom 7 wasn't just a legend, he was a living reminder of missions that certain people preferred to forget. And his sudden reappearance meant that those carefully buried secrets might not stay buried much longer. The text message had been a warning. The shot at Fort Bragg had been an answer. Now the real game could begin. What do you think about this story of hidden legends and impossible shots? Have you ever met someone who turned out to be completely different from what you expected? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if stories like this move you, make sure to subscribe to Real Heroes Stories YT. Because every hero has a story, and some stories are worth remembering forever. Remember, sometimes the most ordinary-looking people around you have extraordinary stories hidden beneath the surface. Sometimes the quiet contractor has the loudest reputation. And sometimes, when the moment calls for it, legends come out of retirement to remind the world why they became legends in the first place. That's the power of a single shot. The power to break records, shatter assumptions, and announce to the world that some people never really leave the fight. They just change the battlefield.